Welcome to the Brazilian Lab lecture series. My name is João Bill. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Brazil Lab. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to the beginning of the year. We are delighted to have Isadora Moura presenting the findings of her incredible book, Freedom's Horizon, today. And we have Yesenia Barragan as a discussant. Miqueias will introduce them shortly. And as I was thinking of Freedom's Horizon, I was also reminded of one of those epigraphs, those luminous epigraphs by Luiz Fernando Veríssimo, the incredible Brazilian writer who recently passed away. One of his sentences that have stayed with me for quite some time is, "O futuro é muito melhor antigamente." The future used to be much better in the past, so we are really living through tumultuous, difficult, uncertain times. And to have this community of thought and practice here, we are quite fortunate to have this at Princeton. And we want to welcome you all to all our events. We want to exchange ideas. We want to cross-pollinate ideas. We want to be free, right, to horizon as a verb, horizontar. Yeah? And the other quote that always comes to mind from Luiz Fernando Veríssimo is, "Ninguém é nada sozinho. Somos o nosso comportamento com o outro. No one is on their own. We are our relationship with others." So we want to cultivate that relationality in the way we listen to each other, care for each other, and produce new knowledge and hopefully practice in the world that's meaningful and socially responsible. So again, welcome all. We are delighted to have you here. And we have a wonderful lineup of events. In 2 weeks, we will screen Apocalypse in the Tropics. Couldn't be more timely. The film by Petra Costa, award-winning, Oscar award-nominated, and an award-winning film itself, Apocalypse in the Tropics. And then we'll have a discussion with the executive producer, Alessandra Orofino, and colleagues here from Princeton and other institutions. And then we'll have the incredible Verenilde Pereira, talking about her book, Rio Sem Fim, A River Without End, that our own Rodrigo Simon has been crucial in bringing it to publication now after many years being a forgotten piece. It's considered one of the first fiction books by an Afro-Indigenous woman in Brazil. And the translator for English from the Brazil Lab supporting Johnny Lawrence will be here as well. And then we will have the screening of another momentous documentary, At This Moment in the Nation Sky, No Céu da Pátria Nesse Instante, by Sandra Kogut, who will be joining us as well. She'll spend a few days with us. And we will end with a discussion of my recent book, The Muka War, in early November. So you're all welcome to participate in the events. And if you have ideas of things you would like us to be doing, improvise, last-minute events, please count on Miqueias, Rodrigo, Tomás, and myself. We will be happy to support you. We also want to call your attention to this incredible science communication outreach that we have through Nexo. Nexo is one of the largest news platforms in Latin America. It reaches, over 1 million people, subscribers, and we have a platform in Nexo. So we publish every week or every other week material that's produced by our fellow scholars, collaborators from Brazil, but also our colleagues from Princeton. So, and we want to invite you, if you have anything that you would like to put out there. Rodrigo Simon, he's an incredible curator of our series in Nexo. And actually, Isadora's piece, Slave Revolts in Brazil in the 19th Century, has already had over 40,000 reads. So she's our bestseller. And we are happy to celebrate you and your incredibly powerful work today. We also have a series with Radio Novelo, this popular, stellar production from Brazil. And you also can go to our website and download and listen to those podcasts. And finally, a little teaser. It's a 1 minute long film that Rodrigo produced of a new series that we are launching today. It's Amazonian Leapfrogging Thinking. And you will recognize the first one, which will be out today in our YouTube channel, is from Supreme Justice of Brazil. Spot, the epicenter of the struggle for democracy. Luis Roberto Barroso, he's talking about the right to a healthy and equitable environment. So I will show now this little video with some snippets of the various interviews that you will see in that series. How do I go, Miguel? Good. Okay.
Environmental rights have become human rights.
The Amazon, which is evolutionary, a very humid ecosystem, is becoming drier and drier.
When we think of water in South America, naturally, we think of the Amazon. The huge rivers, the large floodplains, the big lakes, all the animals.
You have less water going to the atmosphere to be carried out by the flying rivers to other biomes.
You lose rain and you lose water flow in the rivers and you lose the capability of generating electricity.
Para que continue tendo esse reabastecimento dos aquíferos, toda essa manutenção da biodiversidade, toda a manutenção do clima, dos microclimas, da produção de chuvas, tudo isso depende de florestas.
The Amazon that we know today, at least partially, is a product of indigenous agency through the millennium.
Criamos outros métodos de pesquisas para poder dialogar com outras ciências ocidentais.
How do we guarantee the advances that we have made in the past 30 years in providing rights to indigenous peoples?
Essas interconexões para que haja o território mais seguro e para viver bem.
Thank you so much. So nice to see so many familiar faces here today and some new ones as well. So if you want to know more about the Brazil Lab and our initiatives, you can go to our website or the social media. But you can also come to my office and we can talk about our initiatives. My office is in Nuremberg. My name is Miqueias Mugi. I'm a historian by training and I'm an academic research manager here at the lab. We are very, very grateful to the Center of Collaborative History plus the Program Latin American Studies and the Departments of Spanish and Portuguese and Anthropology for helping co-sponsor this event. It is a true joy to open our year by welcoming my dear colleague and dear friend Isadora Mota, who will be speaking, as João mentioned, about her recently launched book. Isadora, can you show us your book? The book. Yeah, the book offers a powerful transnational history of Black abolitionism in the last country of the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. Isadora will talk more about the book, and I want to introduce you to her work, and also to Yesenia, who agreed to come here to Princeton from Rutgers and be the discussant. So Isadora is an assistant professor of history here at Princeton. Her scholarship explores modern Brazilian history, comparative slavery, abolitionism, literacy, and the African diaspora in Latin America. We are also delighted to have with us Yesenia Barragan, an associate professor of history at Rutgers. Her transnational work on race, slavery, and emancipation includes her acclaimed book, Freedoms, Captives, Slavery, and Gradual Emancipation on the Colombian Black Pacific. Here's today's format. Isadora will begin with a 25-minute presentation about the book. Yesenia will then join the conversation with comments and questions. After Isadora's reply, we'll open the floor to discussion with all of you. Before we begin, I know she's not here when I talk this, but I would like to thank the extraordinary manager of the Brazil Lab, Kimberly Biederman. Thank you, Kimberly, wherever you are, for bringing everything together today. And finally, a reminder for after the event, We hope you can join us next door for a reception with snacks and drinks where we can continue the conversation and celebrate together Isadora's book. Isadora.
All right. Good afternoon. Boa tarde a todos. Thank you so much for coming here today to share this moment with me, with all of us. I could spend all of my time just thanking so many people that I see here in this room that have been a part of this project. I won't do that. I'll spare you that. But please feel embraced by me. It really means a lot to see all of you here, some of my colleagues, my friends, my students, some very special young girls in my life, including my daughter, and her dear friend, who is also a tiny bit like my daughter. Right? I would like to thank. So it's a very special moment. Thank you so much, and thank you, Miqueias, who I see as a co-conspirator in the history of slavery, who's been so generous in helping put this event together. Thank you to the Brazil Lab, to João, to Tomás. But Miqueias, I really wanted to thank you especially for for the partnership over the years here, and for always being so excited to talk about the archival findings and the research that we want to do in the future. A lot of this kind of partnerships that I built over the years are very much part of this book. This book is not an individual achievement; it's a collective achievement. And thank you so much for everything. Very well. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about what inspired this book, what was behind the process of producing it, and really quickly going over some main ideas and main stories that I tell in the book. And then I am so happy to have you here, Yesenia. Really, we can put Freedom's Captives and Freedom's Horizon in communication and see where we find hope, struggle, challenges, ideas for the future. And, talking a little bit about what João mentioned in the beginning, I really see this opportunity to talk about slavery, and especially about the struggles, Black struggles for freedom in Brazil, as a way to contribute to what the Brazil Lab has in storage for us this semester in such an important moment of Brazilian history when we are trying to celebrate the 4 years of the redemocratization of the country, but facing lots of challenges politically also in Brazil. So may this horizon be about, the strengthening of democracy in Brazil, like I think it was in the past, that may continue into the future. Okay, now formally I'm going to put my glasses on and we'll start. Growing up in Brazil, I believed from a very early age that storytelling could be a liberating practice. As far as I could see, storytelling seemed to give the least powerful people in that quite unequal society of mine a chance to speak for themselves and, more importantly, to intervene in conversations they hadn't been invited to. Since the history I learned from books before college rarely featured ordinary peoples as protagonists, I have always been drawn to oral traditions and everyday narratives that fill the gaps missed or ignored by my academic experience. Much like the Adagiário Brasileiro, the collection of popular sayings from the Brazilian Northeast that my paternal family collected, the present often revealed its meaning to me in the form of proverbs. The belief that everyone has stories worth telling, including enslaved peoples, and that these stories can be acts of resistance or reclamation, is the main inspiration behind Freedom's Horizon. It is also why, it's going to be hard for me, but we shall get through this. It also why this book is dedicated to Dudy, my second mom, who raised me alongside my parents, a master storyteller from Rio Grande do Sul, no less, who, with no formal education, who taught me that historical understanding begins with empathy. Empathy for the people we study, for those interested in the stories we tell, and for a country that continues to grapple with the legacies of chattel slavery in the present. And I'd like to think that I now pass these lessons she taught me on to my daughter Chloe, to whom this book is also written. Freedom's Horizon highlights moments in Atlantic history when enslaved people found ways to intervene in a conversation they were never invited to join. That conversation about the abolition of slavery. The book emerged from questions I had researching slave rebellions in 19th century Brazil. So after years of mapping out revolts across the country, I realized how much the struggle for Black freedom depended on enslaved people's specific understanding of Brazil's entanglements with the world. My documents spoke, for example, of insurgents and quilombolas, the Brazilian Maroons, linking their activism to the Haitian Revolution, to the British campaign against the slave trade, and to the US Civil War, for example. However, when I examined the available historiography, I noticed a disconnect. On the one hand, slave activism did not fit into the national frameworks typically used to the study of the history of Brazilian abolition, at least not until the 1880s, when they become more and more part of the conversation about abolition in Brazil. On the other hand, when considered in the context of comparative slavery studies, slave rebellions in Brazil were usually viewed as secondary rather than foundational events in Atlantic history. So Freedom's Horizon, in a way, is my attempt to offer a different perspective on the history of abolitionism, one that centers enslaved peoples in Brazil as producers of a transnational Black radical tradition that called for immediate emancipation, at least since the mid-19th century. It is a book about the development of Black abolitionism as a grassroots movement emerging from the senzalas, the slave quarters, and the quilombos, the maroon communities of Brazil. So let me give you an example. This project owes much to a fateful encounter, I would say, I had with the words of enslaved insurgents in Minas Gerais, in the southeast of Brazil. One day, while I was researching in the Brazilian National Archives in Rio de Janeiro, I came across the trial proceedings of an 1864 slave rebellion that happened in the cities of Cerro and Diamantina in the northeast of Minas Gerais, a diamond mining region of Minas Gerais. So the opening testimony of this quite lengthy document revealed that José Cabrinha, Nuno, Faustino, José, and nearly 500 men and women once prepared, and here I quote them, to wage war against the whites, for they had been reading the papers, and through them they realized that a war over the freedom of the slaves, but not of this country, coincided, and here, end quote, coincided with the first debates on gradual emancipation in Brazil. The scene that they evoke here would have resembled the image on the cover of Freedom's Horizon. Something like that happened at that moment in Cerro, where one literate man, one literate enslaved man, in this case, read the newspaper aloud for others to listen. And these listeners were probably people who never had access to any kind of education. They were probably illiterate themselves. So as it turns out, the Black insurgents of Cerro and Diamantina drew inspiration from news probably published in this newspaper called O Jequitinhonha about the US Civil War, and construed abolitionism as a form of engagement with hemispheric history, in this case with the history of the United States. Simply put, in the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, unfortunately Brazil, enslaved men and women often crafted their own visions of liberation by thinking comparatively about the uneven spread of abolition in the Americas. Black freedom elsewhere, so went the geopolitical imagination of the enslaved peoples of Minas, spelled the imminence of emancipation in Brazil. They really thought that the fact that there was a war for the end of slavery somewhere else, in this case in the United States, meant that the time was ripe for them to rise up and perhaps secure their own freedoms in Brazil. So the book is very much about these stories of enslaved peoples in many different parts of Brazil, trying to read the geopolitical scene of the 19th century, to understand how is it that abolition happened in some places, didn't happen in others, but as it advanced, not in a linear line, but eventually as it made more and more free soil over the Americas, they tried to puzzle out what the place of Brazil in this international sphere would be, right? So Freedom's Horizon then traces the development of what I call the Black geopolitical imagination, especially between the 1840s and the 1870s. And here you have like the table of contents where you can perhaps find what you think is interesting in the book. But the idea here is that I am tracing what I call this Black geopolitical imagination in the mid-19th century in the context of slave trade suppression, Anglo-Brazilian relations, the U.S. Civil War, and the Triple Alliance War that happened in South America between 1865 and 1870. So the book actually covers a period that is usually seen as the period of abolition of the slave trade, and therefore a period that comes before abolitionism becomes a mass political movement in Brazil that brings about then more parliamentary action and the end of slavery in the country. But what I say here, what I would say is that the book ends where most accounts of Brazilian abolition begin. It ends in the 1870s when Brazil passes the first emancipation law, the Free Womb Law, in 1871. And the reason is because I wanted to highlight this grassroots activism that has, as protagonists, the enslaved peoples of Brazil that prepared the ground for this moment in the 1870s and the 1880s and also helped bring about abolition in Brazil. So instead of following a traditional timeline of the history of Brazil, it is in dialogue with that, it's in dialogue with what happens in Parliament. The book unfolds according to the themes that enslaved peoples and freed Afro-Brazilians considered relevant to their struggles against freedom. So they set the main events that needed to be talked about in the book. So the book features a range of protagonists who were usually excluded from the abolitionist public sphere. Africans rescued from slave ships that we called Africanos Livres in Brazil, or were known as liberated Africans elsewhere, especially in the British imperial world. Quilombolas, freed persons, and people of color living on the margins of Brazilian society. Chapters follow the horizon of freedom as it moved across the continental territory then claimed by Brazil without the intention of being exhaustive. I explore, for example, slave flight from Amazonian plantations, slave conspiracies in port cities on the northeastern Atlantic coast, the mining hinterlands of Minas Gerais, and small towns along Brazil's contested borders with Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina. So the idea is that slave rebellions and the formation of quilombos in Brazil drive the narrative and take me to the places of Brazil that enslaved people saw as forums of abolitionism, so to speak, as places important as kind of battlegrounds in this history of abolition. And I'm very aware that the boundaries of Brazil at this time in the 19th century are still being built. Brazil is still in the making, especially from the point of view of Quilombola communities who are struggling for land in a country that doesn't allow them to own land. So there's a conversation here that tries to be more transnational than rather a national narrative about abolition. The book's first two chapters revisit the context of Anglo-Brazilian conflicts over the end of the slave trade to expose a tradition of insurgent abolitionism connected to expectations of British support for the end of slavery in Brazil. Here you see this is an illustration coming from a magazine in Brazil in 1863, the Semana Ilustrada. And, you know, this is supposed to be an ironic image of the kind of unrest that black populations found themselves in 1863 as Brazil came to the brink of war with Great Britain. And here you see a scene in which William Christie, the British consul, is, you know, going back to England, and Brazilian children in that sense. They were called the moleques in the magazine, were saying, yes, goodbye, we're getting rid of the English. That's usually what you see on the newspapers, the idea that since the British were seen as the main enemies of slaveholders because they were pressing for the end of the slave trade, that people, there was this animosity towards the British all over the country. And that was true as well. There was animosity, especially on the part of the Brazilian government and of slaveholders. But enslaved peoples themselves were flipping a little bit this discourse and imagining that the British could be their allies in struggles for freedom in Brazil, since they were going against the Brazilian government and sometimes their own masters. So the first part of the book tells a little bit of that story, calls it insurgent abolitionism, and considers this tradition that sometimes brought enslaved peoples and freed people of color in contact with other groups that were also struggling for some degree of autonomy in Brazil, like European immigrants in São Paulo, people who shared sometimes the coffee fields with them, contract laborers that were also facing abuse. So the idea here is to think about abolitionism as something that is also made on the ground by different workers who are sharing some ideas that we don't usually pay attention to, such as the idea that the British could be of help in Brazil at this time. So I examined, for example, how enslaved people sought protection at British consulates and staged uprisings that counted on a British invasion of Brazil. And I argue that enslaved people understood very, very well the importance of the symbolism of their personal and collective acts of allegiance to foreign powers, especially in the mid-19th century, when Brazil became increasingly isolated as a slave empire in the midst of other countries that were already abolishing slavery. So it is this kind of activism that I call grassroots diplomacy in the book. The idea that Africans and their descendants fashioned abolitionism on the ground through grassroots diplomacy, that is, this everyday practice of non-state actors who subverted, sometimes they turned representations of the abolition era completely upside down to challenge slavery from within. The idea that diplomacy also comes from black activism. It's not only, you know, the province of cabinets and parliaments and chiefs of state. Then, just to wrap this up, I'm almost done. Freedom's Horizon is also the first detailed study of how enslaved people in Brazil interpreted the U.S. Civil War. Chapters 3 and 4 explore how information about the war traveled both in print and on the holds of Union merchant ships and Confederate raiders that engaged in naval operations in the South Atlantic. Over the 1860s, Brazil effectively became, I argue, a battlefront, an Atlantic one, of the U.S. Civil War. As black insurgents considered the odds of emancipation by watching these ships, American ships, land prisoners, capture and tow war prizes at will, bombard enemy vessels. A lot of U.S. citizens from both sides died on Brazilian soil, and recruit crew members in waterfront communities. I argue that they escalated their challenge to slavery in Brazil by also acting on what they called free soil, which means they ran away and boarded British and U.S. merchant ships that docked, especially on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, in the case of slave flights to American vessels, especially in the south of Brazil here, in this region of what we call now Santa Catarina. And the book culminates with a study of the emancipation politics of quilombolas, of runaway slaves as they were called at the time, during the Triple Alliance War, an international conflict that placed Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil against Paraguay from 1865 and 1870. During this time, marronage escalated across the Brazilian landscape as the Empire of Brazil allied then with Uruguay and Argentina, as I said, against Paraguay, in what some historians call the first case of total war in South America. I focus on the Brazilian home front, not on the battlefields of Paraguay, but in Brazil, like on the Brazil domestically, where a troop mobilization campaign that included the recruitment of freedmen and growing opposition to the imperial government opened space for Black activism to flourish. Amidst a vacuum in local policing, slave flights soared, and quilombolas joined forces with army deserters of Minas Gerais, Maranhão, and other parts of Brazil that you see on this map to enact emancipation on the ground. So I put this map here of the quilombola communities of Brazil according to the last census of 2022, just to show you that there's a lot of overlap in these stories with quilombola communities that survived to this day in Brazil. The focus of the book is on communities in Minas Gerais and Maranhão, very far away from the battlefields of Paraguay, but that are rebelling, right? Invading, in the eyes of Brazilian government, invading lands, claiming some kind of sovereignty over the places where they live, and attacking plantations in both regions. As Brazil has a vacuum in policing because so much of the Brazilian police and the National Guards, Miqueias can explain everything about it, is called by the imperial government to fight the war in Paraguay. So the idea here is that I also show how quilombolas themselves participated or engaged in what I call grassroots diplomacy by actually interfering in a conflict that is international in scope in South America, right, from the home front in Brazil. Quilombos were very important forums of abolitionism in the country. So just to conclude, ultimately, in Freedom's Horizon, I searched to document Black imaginaries of freedom that expose the limits of history writing about abolitionism itself. To the 1880s in Brazil, the decade of abolition, Afro-descendants and Africans added to the liberal tenor of the official abolitionist movement a different narrative of emancipation that invoked, for example, collaborative literacy, as I mentioned, practices of self-liberation, African cosmologies, different kinds of land claims to the territory now called Brazil, and grassroots diplomacy tactics borrowed from a transnational runaway tradition. In thinking with the protagonists of this book, I am convinced that their struggles also belong in the history of democracy in Brazil. For alongside abolition, a kind of Black political consciousness started to bubble up during this time. It started to come into being. In the 19th century, despite the horrors of slavery, Blackness functioned as a notion capable of producing a range of identities that often challenged the liberal definitions of selfhood and national citizenship championed by the Brazilian elites. And most importantly, I think what enslaved peoples, quilombolas, Africanos livres, produced and thought about during this period provides a blueprint for action based on international solidarity that now stands as a legacy for Afro-descendants in Brazil, for the Povo Preto of Brazil. In a nutshell, that's what I hope the book conveys, and I welcome your comments, Yesenia, and any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm just gonna, do you mind? I'm gonna, oh, do you need a pen? It's right here. You got it? Okay, cool. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I must thank Dr. Muge and the Brazil Lab for this generous invitation to comment on Dr. Mota's spellbinding book. It is truly a tour de force, and I'm absolutely honored, really honored, to be able to celebrate it with you all here and offer some thoughts. But first, truly, thank you so much, Isadora, for gifting us this monumental book, which is no doubt going to change the field tremendously in the months and years to come. So thank you. So as Isadora has just beautifully presented, Freedom's Horizon is a sweeping historical exploration of what one might call the complete history of abolitionism in Brazil, crucially shifting the historical timeline away from the 1870s and 80s, what historians typically understand as the beginning of abolitionism in Brazil, to the early and mid-19th century, decades that witnessed insurgent Black activism among an array of Black actors, from enslaved captives to quilombolas to Africanos Libres, that unquestionably set the necessary political groundwork for the rise of the established capital A abolitionist movement of the later decades, building up to the final abolition of slavery in 1888. But the book does not simply tell us, digamos, like, prehistory of abolitionism in Brazil. It radically alters how scholars and activists, I might add, understand the very meaning of abolitionism. That is, as an insurgent-led Black politics from below that involved local, national, and international, as she beautifully articulated, grassroots diplomacy that crucially loosened over time enslavers' chokehold on captive and runaway Afro-Brazilian people's lives. Here, I want to point to the key subtitle of Isadora's book, Black Abolitionism in 19th century Brazil. This is a study that correctly and brilliantly centers Black Brazilians as the core historical agents in the radical undoing of slavery, key players in a hemispheric, as she writes, quote, Black radical tradition that called for immediate emancipation at least since the mid-19th century. Now, as a fellow historian of slavery and emancipation in the 19th century Americas, I do not mince my words when I say how transformative Isadora's historiographical interventions are to the field, shifting the timeline of abolitionism earlier and reframing how historians and scholars understand abolitionism will not only impact Brazilian history, but will inspire a new generation of scholars studying the African diaspora to rethink well-established historical timelines and movements. What, for example, would a rethinking of abolitionism in Gran Colombia, as I do in my book, or Buenos Aires look like if we destabilize or decenter the gradual emancipation laws adopted in the 1810s and 1820s? Or one that accounts for the deep anti-slavery activism among Maroons pulsating from the Great Dismal Swamp in the U.S. South. I'm thinking here of J. Brent Morris's and Sylvia A. Diouf's work. A few other words on Isadora's brilliance. First, what it manages to do, among many other things, so beautifully and so effortlessly, is to tell a story that privileges the voices and actions of Black subjects while also necessarily weaving in the high politics world that is so profoundly fundamental to these individuals' lives. It's not an easy balancing act, but Isadora's book provides a foundational model for doing that. And fundamentally, this balancing act ties into one of the many key contributions of the book, which is to show how deeply, as Isadora writes, cosmopolitan enslaved people were. That is, they were profoundly aware of the world they inhabited through their insurgent literacy practices. As Isadora reveals, enslaved and runaway Brazilians used the cleavages provided by news of worldwide political events, from the U.S. Civil War to French emancipation, to the War of the Triple Alliance, to make a break for freedom. This is a deeply Atlantic and diasporic history at its finest, untold currents of the 19th century common wind, in the words of the late Julius Scott. As you can imagine, I can go on and on for much longer about how amazing this book is, but finally I'll turn to some questions for Isadora. So my first question is mostly selfish, but I have to ask it because I'm obsessed with how different historians and scholars answer it. And the question is, what is freedom in your book? Of course, historians understand that freedom, especially in the age of modern liberalism, is an elusive concept. But thinking through the book you've produced, the stories you've told, the struggles of the individuals you've chronicled, from the young 12-year-old girl, Leocadia, who refuses to deport herself to Africa with her mother in the 1850s, to the runaways who escaped on U.S. whaling ships in the 1860s. These are truly phenomenal stories that she's unearthed here. How do you conceptualize freedom for these actors in this particular moment of time? My second question concerns more kind of traditional historiographical matters, and that is the importance of region in the study of Brazilian history. So as we both and many of us in this room know, the region has been a crucial mode of analysis for Brazilian and Latin American history as a whole. Colombia, for example, as Nancy Applebaum has argued, has historically been a country of regions, and the same, I know Barbara Weinstein has talked about the same thing about Brazil. Your book obviously departs from this regional tradition and spans the vast extent of the Brazilian nation. You go to the hills, the swamps, the plantations, the cities, the jungle, the coastline, which is to say everywhere. But it's more than just a national and transnational history of Afro-Brazilian insurgent abolitionism. Anyway, I'd love for you to walk us through how you wrestled with these questions of geographical scale in the process of researching and writing the book. My third question, and I have only two more, so don't worry. My third question concerns two keywords that appear in your book, but don't get as extended discussion, that I just want to hear more, I want to know what's going on in your brain. And those are cosmopolitan and Black internationalism. Of course, these are two subjects that are really exploding at the moment in the study of the African diaspora. I'm thinking of Roshana Johnson's book and Mary Hicks' new book as well, and of course the expanding field of Black internationalist history. And I'd love to know how you're thinking through these terms and how they deepen your larger argument about the worldliness of these insurgent Black abolitionists in this moment of time. And then finally, my last question. So apart from the breathtaking geographical work of your book, you move us across mountains and valleys to rivers and jungles, to the Atlantic coast in breathtaking fashion. One of the aspects of the book that I loved is how peopled it is. And by that I mean you show us how profoundly important the history of disparate peoples, including Africanos Libres, Swiss and German colonos, quilombolas, American consular agents, and so on, how important they are to the making of this history of Black radical insurgency. And there were two other historical actors who make occasional appearances in the book that I'd love to hear more about, and that's specifically free Black people and Indigenous people. And my understanding, as we all know, is that the presence of these and actions of these people, at least theoretically, for free people helped destabilize, slavery's hold and, if only showing the lived possibility of non-captivity. And similar kind of things can be said about Indigenous people's presence. So I'd love to hear more if you have any thoughts on the role of these two historical groups of people in your larger story. So that's all I have to say. Truly, I meant it, Isadora. This book was breathtaking, as in it took my breath away. So thank you to you for being you, for all your hard work, and for your deep care, really, to the people who have shown us that a different world is possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Yesenia. Gracias for this, such a generous reading of the, okay, I have to stand up. A generous reading of the book, and I hope it conveys everything that you mentioned here, because it was written under a lot of stress, but with a lot of passion, and I hope it comes through in the ways I tell the stories, in the stories that I choose to tell, in the intervention I try to make. So let me see. starting by what is freedom in the book. That's the question that drives me to write. That's what the idea of Horizon is. Coming from a person that was raised in front of the Atlantic Ocean, the horizon was actually, for me, growing up, the place of possibility. I tended to look into the Atlantic Ocean and try to imagine what came after the horizon, the line right in the horizon. Imagining, like, after taking some classes in colonial Latin America, that all the ships, are gonna go down after the horizon, and monsters are gonna eat everybody. And but there's possibility. Someone can also escape to a world beyond, I thought. So Horizon was not, Freedom's Horizon was not a title that came to me. It was suggested to me during my manuscript workshop with Professor Ada Ferreira and Vincent Brown. And it just made sense to me because I wanted to, as a historian of slavery, we are always dealing with violence, with brutality, with the limits of what enslaved people could achieve or could do or could, in some historical narratives, even understand. I wanted to go against all that and imagine some sense of hope, of possibility, of thinking differently, and that's why freedom is key to this book. But I'd like to think that freedom in this book is kind of multivocal. It has many meanings. It's not one. There's not one freedom. Freedom doesn't mean, in my understanding, doing completely away with slavery. It means struggling for degrees of autonomy, and this autonomy could mean different things for different people. It could mean for mothers to not be separated from their children in slavery. It could mean a war against slavery, a war against the whites, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. It could mean also claiming a place in a conversation about abolition. So many of these enslaved peoples in the book read the newspapers or were conversant with the politics of their own little towns, right? And wanted to have a say in the history that was being made at the time, and never actually got to have, but at least they tried. One of the ways they tried was exactly by rising up, by running away, and creating this tradition that I called insurgent abolitionism. So I think there are many ways of seeing freedom. It's not an absolute, the same way that slavery is also a historical experience. Freedom is the same. I don't see it in absolute terms. In terms of region and the geographic scale of the book, that was done on purpose because I thought, should I do something very contained and focus on a part of Brazil and reproduce a lot of kind of the regional assumptions that we have about the ways that enslaved peoples thought and acted in the world? And then I thought, you know what? I want to run the story I want to go with them and see where they take me. So I started with slave rebellions and quilombos as a way to move through the country and see which places for them were important, which conversations were important, which laws, which other countries were important, which wars were worth considering. And that's what made me go, to different parts of Brazil. And the idea here was also to question assumptions that I think are still part of our historiography, that the history of abolition has to be written as national history necessarily. By that I mean it's part of national history, but doesn't have to belong in the confines of the geographical boundaries of the country that we have nowadays. How can I honor the struggle of quilombolas if I'm saying that the map of Brazil is drawn and there's nothing to be done, limiting, what they were talking about, abolition? So the idea was to write a transnational history of Black abolitionism that included Brazil and, in this case, especially enslaved peoples, in a conversation that is larger. There is this conversation about the Black radical tradition or Black internationalism. It has different names in different parts of the world. But the idea is that Brazil is not outside of this conversation. Brazil is very much part of it. And enslaved peoples in Brazil were thinking comparatively about the end of slavery. And they were very aware of what was going on, not only in the Americas, but there are cases in the book of enslaved peoples thinking about the British invasion of Lagos in what we call Nigeria, things that are happening in Africa, and trying to make sense of their struggle in Brazil by thinking comparatively. What is it that is happening here? What is it that we can do if we, really take seriously the place that Brazil occupies as a slave empire in a world that is grappling with the end of slavery, not necessarily, ending it, but grappling with the issue. So in that sense, I wanted to highlight their, as I said, their worldliness, very difficult word in English for me, their cosmopolitanism, the fact that, and here is I think is what I wanted to say about literacy that is so important for me in this book, is the idea that most of the protagonists of the book didn't know how to read and write. They were not writing treatises about abolition. They were not necessarily conversant with all the debates in Parliament that we see printed in the newspapers. They were conversant with general ideas, and much, I think, more important than that, they were, through their own experience, they were making a point of participating in this debate. So the idea that, enslaved peoples in Brazil have nothing to contribute to the history of abolition or to this Black radical tradition because, they were mostly illiterate, they were brutalized by slavery, they were just objects and not subjects of this history of slavery, to me is something that should be obvious. But when you read what's been out there about enslaved peoples in Latin America, it's not always the case. Right? We don't take seriously the fact that we have these groups of people reading newspapers together, that people are sitting down and dictating letters to others, that they are producing petitions asking the monarch to free them. And that's what I try to do in the book, is to call attention to the fact that literacy is key to Black abolitionism, and that even people who were not literate or highly educated, they had access and they participated in a written culture that was also of their making, was not only imposed at them. And lastly, that the book is peopled. I'm so happy about that. That's the idea, is that going back to my early days in college, I think is that idea of people make history, everything else I'm not interested in, is trying to engage with that in a new way and think about it from the point of view of enslaved peoples. And then I deal a little bit with indigenous peoples, especially in the last chapter, especially when talking about the quilombola communities of Brazil and how mixed and diverse they were. I can do much more. I want to do much more. I have sources to do much more about indigenous peoples. And what I see here is an attempt to say, at least to begin to grapple with this issue, is to say they were there. There were tensions, and there was also solidarity with enslaved peoples struggling for freedom. Relationships were very complicated, many times mediated by the Brazilian state, making it much more complicated than I would have liked. So there's no romanticization of the past and ideas of kind of our oppressed peoples unite in Brazil in the struggle for abolition. That's not it. But the idea is to say, for example, there is a reason why the Brazilian state is so set on decimating quilombola communities in 19th century Brazil. It's because they had indigenous peoples in them. It's because they had army deserters in them. It's because what they thought in those places was so radical that it had to be done away with. Right? So they were also a threat, quite frankly, I think, to the Brazilian government in many parts of the country, especially in Maranhão. Did I answer? Perfect. Yeah. I'm trying not to talk on and on and on. Thank you, Isadora.
Thank you.
So we have some 30 minutes for Q&A, and maybe for us to have more people speaking, we could collect bundles of 3 questions for Isadora, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, Pedro?
first in line. Thank you so much, Isadora. It's beautiful, and I wanna. You may have answered my question already, but I guess I wanna hear more and more from you. And it goes back to Yesenia's question that she raised about geographical scale, and you so properly answered. But there is something kind of magical from someone who is not a historian about this, the fact that you have Minas Gerais, Maranhão, and the Front War in Paraguay, and things were happening at the same time. So there was something circulating there, and I kept asking myself, who or what exactly in terms of a supporti were the carriers of the news? I mean, you would say, well, first of all, and obviously newspapers, right? But then you show, and I think that this image very much encapsulates it, that there is something about the storytelling that is really working together. And then there's this fine line that I even don't know if it exists between what is storytelling, I mean, on the verge of becoming fiction, possibly, and what is the news, the official news, right? I think that I'm thinking of Machado de Assis, obviously, who was a master of working within, I mean, and crossing this fine line in a very ironic way. But also, I guess that this fine line has to do with this tension between grassroots, what is happening there, and what may happen at the level of policy making, the elites, what one day was called ciudad letrada in our departments in literatura. So, but there is something else, I guess, and I think, which is the sonorous aspect. I mean, that is at the very center of this fine line and this circulation of ideas. So maybe the magic is exactly in the fact that we're talking about sounds and not about the written word, or something that is beyond possibly the written word. So I just wanted to hear from you about this. I think it's a big question in the sense that theoretically it kind of explains possibly the magic of this communication, which permits you to think in a larger scale, actually. Thank you.
Should I go on or are you going to collect?
Luana?
Oh, okay. So collect the questions.
Collect three, yeah.
All right.
And I think I'm going to help because my question is going to be connected to Pedro's question. Is related to the literatura de cordel, because one of the images that you have in the very first slide, it was an example of a publication of literatura de cordel, and I was thinking about this when I saw the image, the poem, I was like, I need to ask her about that. And I think it's also connected to the idea of literacy that you were talking about and spreading the news, how people, for example, in the northeast of Brazil, use the literatura de cordel as the news, as a way that you spread the news. People get together to recite poetry, to recite those, and many people who produce that literature, they do not know how to read or write. So I was curious if you talk a little bit more about literatura de cordel and the role of literatura de cordel and this communication. I think it's connecting to what Pedro was going through, not just the news itself, like the newspaper, but what's the role of literature, and specifically literatura de cordel in this context. It relates to this connection, how they were building those connections through literature, through poetry.
Yes.
Yes. My name is Brandon. I'm a PhD student in Spanish and Portuguese. Yes. I really love this book. I can't wait to read it. I'm also wondering, in terms of the term grassroots diplomacy, how did you end up coming up with the term? What kind of theories and positioning to power does it hold? Is it rooted in any activist theories in particular? Basically, yeah. What kind of real life scenarios or things have you seen that have influenced the production of this term? And how can you see it being applied across historical boundaries between early modern period, modernism?
Thank you. Well, very happy with the questions because I'm in the process of writing them. Sorry, I have to get writing a new book that is about exactly Black literacy in 19th century Brazil, because that's what one of the main takeaways of this research process of producing this book is that what we call in Portuguese letramento, which is it's different than the idea of literacy in English. Letramento that can be both, in some relationship with the written word, but it's also a kind of literacy that can go back to oral sources. What was really the most surprising thing, I think, of writing this book is realizing how important this idea of letramento, of literacy, was. How diverse that literacy happened on the spectrum. There were people that knew how to read. There were people who just knew how to, sign their names. Other people knew could read the headlines of a newspaper but could not read a manuscript document. So many of the enslaved peoples that I talk about produced documents through intermediaries and collaborated with people in producing documents that actually tried to advance their freedom in some ways. And I wanted to take it seriously. I wanted to understand what was going on. So Pedro, in terms of the who were or what was like the carriers of news, there's a big discussion in the book also about the place of rumor within these Black communities. And taking rumors seriously, not as misinformation, but as one aspect of popular cultures that was very important in the understanding of abolition. So not everybody knew exactly what was going on in the Civil War, for example. We have many instances in the book in which even Brazilian authorities are like, what in the world is going on? There are two countries right now. What are they called? What are the different flags? Are they, for or against us? Who should we side with? With these enslaved populations was the same. They had a vague idea of this war going on abroad, and they knew that slavery was important in this war, but they couldn't tell you anything about the Battle of Gettysburg or anything like that, right? So the place of rumor, and this rumor that comes from reading something or from overhearing conversations, or from sometimes divining practices, sometimes from, encounters from storytelling in taverns, many moments of reading something aloud that could be also related to poetry, to this kind of oral literature, as we call it. This was happening all the time in the lives of enslaved peoples, and that's why that's how they exchanged the news. So there is rumor, but there is also writing, there is overhearing their masters' conversations. There are instances in the book of enslaved peoples who knew how to write by sitting in the classes that young white boys were having at home with their little ABCs. So the path to literacy was very kind of difficult, but yet there was this tension between the oral and the written, and access to literacy is always present in the ways that people were learning about abolition in Brazil. Sounds are very important in this way. They are also not only understanding the history of abolition, but recording the history of abolition through song. And this region of Minas Gerais that I showed you is one of the regions from which we have, what is the name in English? The Visungos, what is the name? I don't know the translation for this. Work songs that enslaved peoples and their descendants had in Minas Gerais, and that they songs that talked about everything, their daily lives, about slavery, there are songs, for example, about what was happening in the diamond mines where this slave rebellion happened in 1864. That's been recorded through song. And then call and response, and Iris da Mata Machado recorded this, put it in writing for us to kind of read later on, this call and response work songs from Minas Gerais. So the oral is very much part of this story. And so I put the cordel over there because I'm absolutely obsessed with Cordell literature. My parents are from the Northeast, and I've been always very interested in the little Cordell books, the oral literature that then is made into writing, that talks about slavery, abolition. We have it all. We have Zumbi, we have Quilombos, we have Princess Isabel. We have the whole history of Brazil in the form of Cordell literature. And what I'm trying to do, I think, is to understand how people still nowadays inhabit this space between the oral and the written, and understand the history of the country through song. There are the violeiros of Ceará, which I grew up hearing about, and all these storytellers from places in Brazil that, for example, those instances that we have as historians of going in someone's house and seeing a picture of Getúlio Vargas, or an illustration with Princess Isabel, trying to understand how people nowadays in their everyday lives grapple with history. That's been my passion. And grassroots diplomacy, if you want a very honest question, I spent one day writing the whole day. I went to bed very, very late at night, and I dreamed about. The name came to me, the expression came to me in a dream, and I'm like, okay, this is going all around: orality, literacy, magic, and everything. This is coming together. I'm gonna use this. But the idea here is to bring together. In the beginning, for the book, I used a lot of consular documents coming from the Itamaraty archives in Brazil, or from the British Foreign Office, from NARA here, from U.S. Foreign Affairs archives as well. And I think they are very hard for me. They are very hard to read. They are very difficult archives to navigate, because the violence of slavery has its imprint everywhere. The way that enslaved peoples are talked about, the ways that their ideas are diminished, the ways that women are not named but referred to. So in the beginning, when this book that started as my PhD dissertation at Brown, I went to all these conferences and people were saying, oh, if you were talking about abolition, U.S. Civil War, and the British, you're doing diplomatic history, right? And I'm like, absolutely not. I'm doing, this is the history of slavery, this is social history, this is something else. And then I started to realize that, oh yes, let me take part in this conversation I have never been invited to talk about diplomacy from the point of view of grassroots activism. For me, it was very clear that that's exactly what enslaved peoples were doing in Brazil. And I think this is a kind of malleable idea or concept, if you will, that can be used in other places, that can be seen in other places. And I've tried to play around a little bit with this in the new things that I'm writing, trying to imagine also, for example, indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon, on the border with Peru in the 19th century. There are many kind of millenarian movements and also insurgencies in that part of the country, in the part of Brazil, right? But very murky boundaries between Brazil and Peru. And that's where I'm trying, I try to imagine, this is where grassroots diplomacy can also work, right? In the politics of indigenous peoples, and in this kind of trying to claim sovereignty over land that is neither Brazilian nor Peruvian, that is the Amazon. It's seen as, through a completely different lens. This is like extrapolating a little bit to use it in, I think it can be used in different contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isadora. This is just absolutely exquisite, thoughtful, beautiful, lively, your craft and your voice, and the way you break open, the archive, and the way you let movement and incompleteness to remain with us. So my question, I think, follows exactly where you landed. where is God and spirituality in Black abolitionist storytelling?
My question, I also want to thank you, Isadora, for this, during this whole conversation and during the time where you were presenting us with this beautiful work, I kept getting goosebumps. I felt it in my body in such an incredible way, and I'm really, really excited to read you. My question is actually a little bit self-indulgent in the sense that I would like, I'm really mesmerized by the ways in which the people that populate your book come to understandings of their autonomy, perhaps in various ways, in various places that we might consider unlikely. I think that there's a way in which particularly like understandings of political subjectivity are ingrained in this idea that people have to engage in a particular way with the written word, that they have to participate actively in the production of culture in these particular ways that are very Western based, right, understanding. So I'm wondering, and my question is like, which is the unlikeliest place in which you found something that just completely shifted something that you might have held about what was possible? Like what, it might be like the smallest moment that completely reshifted your perspective. I'm really curious about that.
And then Susanna.
All right.
I was also in the group, the lucky group, like Marcel, that last year we had the pleasure of hear Isadora speak about the book, always so beautifully and with so much care. And I don't have a question. I just wanted to share something that I was thinking is that because I heard you talk about this book in many ways and forms, but this was the first time that I actually like touched the book and saw it, and I think I decided.
Live, you were
yeah. And I think that I decided that I'm gonna start reading your book pelo final. So I'm gonna start with the last chapter that is titled "How the Enslaved Story Their World." And of course, at first, like my Portuguese-speaking mind stopped at storied, and I thought how they store it, how they kept their world. But then, of course, the play there is how their world became a story, right? And I was thinking about, I was listening to you and trying to think within this tension of stories and histories, right? And a teller and a writer, and of course that when an English major at Columbia develops this tension, it becomes a method, a question of method. But then when a historian does it, it becomes something else. It becomes a question of form, right? And form is important because how can you give form to something that has no shape, like imagination, like diplomacy, like freedom, like horizon, right? So what is the form of horizon, Isadora? I think I'm gonna go home tonight with that question. You know? I'm gonna go home tonight, hopefully, with that question in your book. That it's so wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy.
It's because Susanna did not have a question, right?
No, she did not. It was just so maybe I don't have an answer because she didn't have a question. Okay, so let's go. João, God, Allah, in its many iterations, the Orishas are everywhere in the book because they are so much part of enslaved people's understanding of rebellion, of freedom, of slavery, of abolition. And so many of the rebellions that I study in this book came about through, in moments, after moments of, sometimes these newspaper readings happened alongside divination practices or religious encounters. The rebellion of 1864 that I talked about, the plan was for some of the enslaved peoples in that rebellion were part of a black brotherhood in Cerro. And their plan was to get together in front of the Rosary Church, which was, a historically black church in that town, to start the rebellion from there. They would be in front of the church, and from there the church was high up, and then they were going to descend upon the city, target all the big diamond traders. Kill them, and then invade the National Guard's the headquarters, get all the weapons, and then go from there. So the religion is part of their organizing, is part of what informs their visions of the world, but it's also part of their strategies. They wanted to gather in front of the church, not only because yes, it's on top of a hill, it's strategically nice, but that gives you some kind of leverage that is also spiritual, right? And so many of these rebellions that are happening throughout the country, especially in São Paulo, in the Paraíba River Valley, or in Bahia, there are many instances here, are led by the spiritual leaders and healers of these black communities. So there's a big intersection between religion or spirituality and rebellion in the book. And I take it very seriously because religion is very much part of their politics. There's, here, there's a different relationship between religion and politics. I tremble when I say that because nowadays in Brazil, it's such a hard topic to talk about. But in this case, the intersection of religion and politics could also lead to rebellion, right, to insurgency. Thank you, Maciel. Thank you. So nice to see you here. Thank you for your question. Yes, the idea is that, in the book is that political subjectivity can take different forms. It doesn't have to be the citizenship that is allowed by the state. It doesn't have to be the idea that you have to belong to a nation state at all. In the slave rebellions that I researched, I never saw an enslaved person saying, I want to be part of Brazil. I want to be part of this national community. They want to be free. Are you guys okay? They want to be free. I'm almost done. An unexpected place where I found something that really changed the way I think. I think the unexpected places where I found people reading or talking about something in writing, or producing a document. And when I say unexpected places, I really mean it. For example, petitions that are written by enslaved peoples that work in the, what is it in English? I think it's called the leprosarium, the place where, the hospital for leprosy, yeah, that treated leprosy. In a place like that, you also had slavery in Brazil. And you have enslaved peoples in these places caring for the sick, who are also writing petitions to the government and asking for their freedom based on these ideas that were circulating. To me, that blew my mind, that you can find insurgency in the most unexpected places. And I think perhaps that was a radical one for me. More radical even, because this place that was the hospital, what is the hospital to treat lepers? Does it have a name?
I think it's leprosarium.
Leprosarium. This place became a historical archive. It's now the Archives of Bahia, right? In Salvador, it used to be the old leprosarium. So it's like, oh my goodness, the place where we hold these documents that I write about used to be in this hospital where enslaved people, struggled for their freedom. To me, that was like a very mind-blowing experience. And Suzanne, I'm gonna have to think about this one. But what I wanted to say, and that epilogue was the last thing that I actually wrote. So I think that's when my thoughts were coming together, really, and I understood what is it that I was trying to say with this book. And what I wanted to say is that these people's imagination was necessary for abolition. Without their imagination, it wouldn't have happened. because when you think about abolitionism, you usually imagine perhaps like this big abolitionist campaign, abolitionist newspapers, debates in Congress, or British abolitionists or American abolitionists coming to bear. And abolitionism for me is a movement with multiple genealogies. It can be seen in different ways. It can also be the grassroots activism of these people that I talk about. And the way that they storied their world, the way that they understood their world is key. Their imagination is key, even though the kinds of freedom that they imagined never came true in Brazil after 1888, and we are still struggling for it. Right, but this idea that you need to imagine that there is a horizon that has to be in your head, that some sense of possibility has to be shared at some point for these movements to occur, I think it was the main takeaway for me. Now about form, I'll have to think about that one. That question coming from art history, I see that. It's a struggle to kind of bring these traditions that sometimes were so diffuse, were oral, were written, were lost, were shared in many parts of Brazil. It's so hard to put them together. I don't know which other form they can take, but I'll think further about that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Isadora.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.